Afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Susan Schneider, who is an outstanding researcher. And I had the great pleasure already chatting with her a few times now, and it's just amazing, her background. So Dr. Schneider is a professor of philosophy and also the center director for the Center on the Future of the Mind here at Florida Atlantic University. Before coming to FAU, she held a number of very distinguished positions, and just to name a few, she was the NASA Baruch Blumberg's chair of the Library of Congress and NASA, the Distinguished Scholar Chair at the Library of Congress, and the director of the AI, Mind, and Society Group at the University of Connecticut, where she also was professor of philosophy and cognitive science. I will just turn it over to Dr. Schneider and let her tell you about her fabulous research. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, Karen, and thank you for your kind introduction. And Jennifer, thanks for setting me up behind the scenes. It's delightful to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my slides. Just give me a second. Today, I'm giving a presentation on the future of the mind, and I'll be talking about my recent book called Artificial You, AI, and the Future of Your Mind. So I'm going to canvass a variety of issues involving the mind and the future. So I'll start with a thought experiment because I'm a philosopher and I love thought experiments. This is the first paragraph of my book, and it involves you. So here we go. It's 2045, and today you're out shopping. Your first stop is the Center for Mind Design. As you walk in, a large menu stands before you. It lists brain enhancements with funky names. Hive Mind is a brain chip allowing you to experience the innermost thoughts of your loved ones. Zen Garden is a microchip for Zen master level meditative states. Human Calculate will give you savant level mathematical abilities. So what would you select, if anything? Enhanced attention, Mozart level musical skills? You can order a single enhancement or a bundle of several. So this talk then is about the future of the mind. It's about how our understanding of ourselves, our minds, and our very nature can actually change the future for better or for worse. So today, what I'll ask is the following. At a place like the Center for Mind Design, could you truly merge with artificial intelligence? Well, here's where I'll go. First off, I'll sketch some background on a view called transhumanism and on neurotechnology from the science side, as well as age-old philosophical questions about our nature. Second, I'll talk about something I've been discussing recently in a series of op-eds for places like the New York Times and the Financial Times. A concern I have about design ceilings on human intelligence augmentation involving philosophical issues, believe it or not, such as consciousness and the nature of persons. And finally, I'll close by discussing my work as NASA chair very briefly, discussing our place in the cosmos and the road ahead for human intelligence. So, some background. Well, as many of you know, the evolution of the human brain was heavily constrained by environmental, anatomic, and metabolic demands. AI-based brain enhancements, in principle at least, could, in contrast, augment intelligence at a rate that's much quicker than biological evolution. Well, I call this new enterprise mind design. And think about it, this is strange, but it's actually a kind of intelligent design, as Richard Dawkins himself points out. But we, not some god, purport to be the designers. Well, I find the idea of mind design very humbling, frankly, because we humans were not terribly evolved. we walk the moon, we harness the energy of the atom, yet racism, greed, and violence are all too commonplace. Overall, our technological development often lags behind our technological capacities. So given all this, I think we need to start thinking about the future of intelligence now. Okay, so in order to do that, I want to take you back to that initial thought experiment. I want you to suppose that you're standing in line at the Center for Mind Design. And again, there's this giant menu. And somebody comes up to you who works there and they start chatting you up and they say, hey, guess what? I have a secret for you. You should come back in a few months, actually, because if clinical trials go as planned, you will soon be able to buy an enhancement bundle called Merge. This is a series of enhancements that allows you to gradually augment and transfer all of your mental functions to the cloud over a period of 5 years. So let me ask you this. Could you actually merge with artificial intelligence in this way? Well, before I answer, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to clarify what I mean by merging with artificial intelligence. And secondly, as a futurist, people often ask me, isn't this idea of a merger too speculative to worry about? So I want to address both of these issues. Well, I want to talk about this idea of merging with AI because I see it a lot in the media. Transhumanists for years have been discussing the idea that humans can overcome their biological limitations through science and technology. And of course, there's little that's objectionable about that, but they offer a very controversial trajectory to get there, to achieve this end that they'd like to see. They start with the unenhanced human, you and I, who engages in significant upgrading with cognitive and perceptual and other physical enhancements. And these upgrades are optional. And over time, as more and more of these technologies develop, at some point the person is no longer technically human, and they are called, in the transhumanist vocabulary, post-humans. As that enhancement progresses even farther, at some point the individual actually merges with artificial intelligence, being an AI, having an artificial brain, being super intelligent, in fact, smarter than any unenhanced human in every way possible, scientific reasoning, social skills, and more. This trajectory is obviously very ambitious, very futuristic. It's adhered to by some very interesting people. So for example, Elon Musk, Nick Bostrom, who runs the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, Natasha Vita-More, who's, I'm honored to say, is now a fellow at our new center at FAU, Ray Kurzweil, a leading futurist who's been writing some amazingly visionary books on this subject for 20 years, and the late Stephen Hawking. You may also have read some books by Michio Kaku, who's definitely in this tradition. The list is long. Now, what I'm going to talk about today in terms of this trajectory is one part of the equation in particular. These transhumanists who offer this trajectory say that enhancements will increasingly involve replacing parts of the brain with AI components. And I want to focus on that kind of enhancement, this idea of invasive brain chips. Because, well, the talk is short, for one thing, but the other thing to consider is that there are all kinds of paths to intelligence enhancement. I mean, even coffee helps with attention. That's probably why I drink so much of it. But there are genetic roots, and each of them carry, I don't think coffee carries a lot of ethical issues, except maybe you might wonder where it's made. But I mean, genetic enhancements do, but I'm not going to talk about the whole thing today. I'm going to focus on invasive brain chip development and this idea of standing at the center of and trying to decide what brain chips to add. Well, this seems speculative. However, transhumanism is actually a very influential view of the future of the mind. For example, in Washington, D.C., where I work with Congress, on AI-related issues, it's very influential. And often when I'm on panels at places like Politico, there's a transhumanist on the panel who's a tech guru who a lot of people are listening to. That's very common. Furthermore, as a philosopher, I find it to be a quite interesting idea that we could replace parts of the brain with AI components, because it touches on a classical philosophical issue, and an issue that people who have religious views care deeply about. Does consciousness transcend the biological brain? Okay, and I'll be talking more about that today. Furthermore, as a cognitive scientist, there's a dominant view of the nature of mind in cognitive science today, and that is the idea that the mind is something like a software program. Well, when I wrote my first book for MIT Press, I was very sympathetic to that idea. But as I thought about it more in this monograph, I actually believe now that the idea is flawed, that the mind isn't something like a software program, although the computational view of the nature of the brain in cognitive science is very important, and I think an extremely useful research strategy. Okay, and finally, it's important to not commit the Jetsons fallacy when we're thinking of the future. By this, I mean the following. When you think of films like Star Wars or the cartoon The Jetsons, notice that humans are depicted as unenhanced, but all around them, there's all this incredible AI technology, you know, R2-D2, C3PO, and whatnot. But in reality, the future may not be like that. AI won't just change the world. It will actually go inside the head and change human cognition and perception as well. And that leads me to talk about research trends. So Elon Musk recently said that humans can keep up with AI by having some sort of merger of biological intelligence and machine intelligence. And to this end, he created a company called Neuralink, which has as its primary goal to create eventual implantable brain chips, allowing data from the brain to travel wirelessly to one's digital devices. He's already created some of this technology in the context of animal research. So there are pigs wearing the chips right now. I think he's about to release a video on YouTube with monkeys playing video games and whatnot. Now, this kind of research has been around for a while. In the context of brain therapies, not just brain enhancements. So for example, the hippocampus is part of the brain that enables one to lay down new memories. And when it breaks, it's devastating. Well, Ted Berger has been developing the artificial hippocampus, which is a brain chip, which is now in phase 2 clinical trials in humans to help encode new memories with success. So this kind of work has also been picked up on, obviously, by the Defense Department, by DARPA, in particular, the Advanced Technology Research Wing of the Defense Department. They've been working on closed loop neural implants for PTSD and all sorts of mental disorders, and obviously with interest in creating super soldiers for important, I mean, not easily dismissed issues involving humans being able to keep in the perceptual loop in making decisions about who to fire on and how to react on the field. Facebook and Kernel have also been working on this kind of technology. I imagine Google is too. It is by many considered to be the next big wave of artificial intelligence research, AI in the head. Now, I find this frightening ethically as well. If you Google my name and you look up the publication 1.0, I have a blog piece on the more here and now social implications that I worry about. But today, I'm going to wear the hat of a theorist and talk more about some issues in the field of philosophy of mind and in cognitive science. In particular, I'm going to talk about design ceilings now. So by design ceilings, I mean this. I'm interested in limits on human intelligence enhancement that actually aren't imposed by evolution or even technology. They're actually philosophical in nature. Now, that being said, neurotechnology will, of course, pose all sorts of limits to brain augmentation as well. But I'm actually interested in the philosophical side as it touches on the science. In particular, I'll explore today 2 design ceilings that I'll be talking about in a new book I'm writing for Norton. So first, I'll talk about the consciousness ceiling, which arises if microchips fail to underlie conscious experience. I recently laid this out in an invited op-ed for the New York Times. Secondly, I'll be talking about the self-sealing, which I talk about in this book. This is a point beyond which the person who attempts to enhance is no longer the same individual they were before, because the procedure causes them to actually cease to exist. Okay, and that I discussed that very briefly in an op-ed for the Financial Times. Okay, so let's turn to the consciousness ceiling. So as a philosopher, I've long been interested in consciousness. I had the pleasure of doing this lengthy research companion guide to consciousness with the psychologist Max Vellemans. So consciousness is this, okay? It's best explained by example. So when you see the rich hues of a sunset, or you smell the aroma of your morning espresso shot, it feels like something to be you. It always feels like something from the inside to be you, at least whenever you're awake and even when you're dreaming. Well, consciousness is this felt quality of inner experience that's actually unique in the sense that nobody around you can actually feel it from the inside, what it feels like to be you. This relates to an important problem in philosophy called the hard problem of consciousness. Why are we conscious? Given that cognitive science says that, you know, the brain is an information processing engine. Why does it need to feel like anything from the inside? Well, I'm not going to delve into that problem today, although, you know, I've explored it in my work. But what I want right now is to just call attention to this phenomena of conscious experience, because it's very important. I think it's one of the most beautiful things about our existence, that it feels like something to be us. And it's also one of the most important mysteries around right now, because it's not clear that we can find an answer for it in today's science. Okay, now Richard Dawkins recently remarked in a film that we were both in called Super Sapiens, it's not obvious to me that a replacement of our species by our own technological creations would necessarily be a bad thing. And of course, he said this in this wonderful British accent, which I can't mimic, but it sounded very authoritative the way he said it. But in response to Dawkins, look, if non-conscious machines supplant biological intelligence, then the technological singularity, you know, the point at which AI overtakes humans and starts, you know, creating all kinds of disease cures and problem solutions that we need, that point would still actually be a nightmare, because it would represent the end of consciousness on Earth. So if machines can't be conscious, you know, all the good stuff that AI promises will actually not really matter, because they're, you know, if they supplant us, that is, if they supplant biological intelligence, not just aid biological intelligence. Okay, so that was a kind of response to Dawkins, because he was claiming that it was non-obvious that a replacement of our species by our technological creations would be a bad thing. Well, that leads me to lay out what I call the consciousness ceiling. Let's go back to the Center for Mind Design. You're standing there and you say to yourself, what if you buy merge? Should you do it? Well, here's something to bear in mind. If AI isn't conscious, like if it can't feel like anything to be an artificial intelligence, then merging is actually a bad idea. It won't help you to become an AI or to have an artificial brain. Because if microchips are the wrong stuff, then a mind-machine merger can't happen. If you try, you lose your consciousness and your mind would no longer exist. This would be an enhancement wall. That is a hard limitation on human intelligence augmentation that needs to be taken into consideration in all of these projects on brain enhancement. In contrast, AI wouldn't hit that wall. It's not conscious anyway, and it's free to overtake us in its level of intelligence, but it wouldn't feel like anything to be it. Okay, so that's the consciousness ceiling. And I think if you're at that Center for Mind Design, you would want to know whether microchips are the right stuff to underlie conscious experience. All right, well, that being said, what I want to now do is lay out a second ceiling. For the sake of argument, let's suppose that consciousness, that ceiling, it does not arise. Are you free to buy merge then? Or is it a good idea? Well, let me suggest something wearing the hat of a philosopher. In order to understand whether you should actually enhance, you need to first understand what and who you are to begin with from a philosophical standpoint. That is, what is it to be a person? Would you continue to exist if you bought merge, or would you have been replaced by someone or something else? Okay, now to delve into this just briefly, think about the field in contemporary philosophy called metaphysics, not that new age stuff that you might see a lot of at the bookstore. I'm talking about the field related to the work of people like Leibniz and Descartes and Plato, Aristotle. Well, consider the metaphysics of everyday objects, if you will. And here's an example, a very simple example. Suppose you're standing in your favorite coffee house and the barista, you're talking to the barista, and she's a philosophy major, so you're talking about the nature of objects and, you know, under what conditions they continue to exist over time. Well, you might ask the barista, if I take out a science fiction ray gun and I vaporize the coffee machine, does it cease to exist? And she'll say, of course it does. Well, what if I simply break it? Well, no, it doesn't cease to exist. Well, the upshot is that some features or properties of a thing are necessary for the thing to continue to exist, and others are not. And the kind of million-dollar question here is, what features are essential to you? Do you have a soul, for example? Or is your mind just your brain? What are you? That's what I'm asking about as a philosopher. Now, what does this have to do with brain enhancement? Well, consider the following. Even if brain enhancement brings super intelligence, it makes you smarter than any unenhanced human, it must not involve the elimination of any of your essential features or properties, because in that case, you wouldn't have really merged with artificial intelligence, contra Musk, Kurzweil, Stephen Hawking, and so on. Because even if the technology works, the sharper mind would actually be experienced by someone or something else. So you would have paid money, but never left the enhancement center. Okay, so this leads me then to what I call a self-sealing. It's a point beyond which the person who attempts to enhance is no longer the same individual they were before, because the procedure, the individual who sought enhancement, the procedure that the person who sought enhancement actually causes them to cease to exist. Okay? So in order to figure out whether there really is a self-sealing, and I suspect sadly that there are ceilings like this, you need to ask, what are we? And there are different theories in the field of metaphysics on the nature of the person. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through all of these, but one such theory is brain-based materialism, which you may have heard about. So, for example, on this view, you are essentially your brain or your nervous system, and perhaps elements of your body that outrun your nervous system as well. But that's a view that's called materialism. And on that view, as I said in the op-ed in the Financial Times, you wouldn't survive if you tried to merge with AI because you're your brain and you'd be removing parts of your brain. Well, another influential view has been called the psychological continuity view. So on this view, you are your memories and your ability to reflect on yourself, as Locke put it. And in its most general form, because this view has different forms, you are your overall psychological configuration. A particular view that I like, which is a version of the psychological continuity view, or at least I like to talk about it, I disagree with it, I think it's interesting though, is called patternism. And that's a view that's actually upheld by a lot of transhumanists, like, for example, Ray Kurzweil and Nick Bostrom. And this view says that what's essential to you is your overall neurocomputational configuration. That is, the sensory systems and subsystems that the brain has, like early vision, for example, the association areas of the brain that integrate basic sensory systems, and overall, the neural circuitry making up your domain general reasoning, your attentional system, your memories, and so on. This is all important, but what's really key here is something like the Uber algorithm that describes all of the brain processing. All these different areas inform that algorithm, and that is what you are. You're a sort of pattern or algorithm that describes how your brain computes. Now, that's a version of the psychological continuity view that has become very important in recent years. There are other theories as well. A lot of people adhere to a soul theory. And in that case, your mind or your essence is something like a soul that can be non-physical and distinct from your physical body. Also influential in philosophy is the no self view. It says the self is an illusion. There are bundles of impression, but there's no underlying self. This goes back to the philosopher Hume. And there's no survival because there's really no underlying self there at all. The Buddha is known for having this kind of view, as is Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, and a philosopher who recently passed away, who's very of great interest in contemporary philosophy, Derek Parfit. Okay, well, so all this being said, could you merge with AI according to any of these views? Each of these views of personal identity or the nature of the self has its own implications about whether you could merge at the Center for Mind Design. So first off, brain-based materialism. You can't change substrates. You die if you replace too much of the biological brain. So, on that view, neurotechnology has its limits in the following sense. It should aim to develop biological brain enhancements and minimal AI-based enhancements that do not replace or damage key parts of the biological brain, especially those that underlie consciousness. What about the soul theory? Well, in that case, your decision to enhance depends upon whether you think the person walking out of the Center for Mind Design is still a person that your soul bears that same connection to. And there, it depends upon a deep conversation with your religious advisors and deep personal reflection based on your religion. What about the no self view? Well, this is a bit of a wise guy move, but you don't really merge with AI on this view because they're not really a you to begin with, right? So the idea that you could really merge with AI, it's not really applicable in this case because you don't survive technically from second to second. There's really no you. You may strive to enhance for other reasons. However, you might believe that by merging with artificial intelligence, you're doing something for the greater good. Maybe a greater intelligence will contribute to the flourishing of sentience in the universe, but the conscious beings, they don't really last. There's really no underlying self. Okay, what about patternism? Because I said that was a view that the transhumanists like. Well, here's a problem. It's a big problem. A part of the book talks about this in great detail. We don't really know when this algorithm begins or ends. Like if you change an algorithm, just technically, even in a minuscule way, you've really changed the entire algorithm. So what the transhumanist has to mean here is that there's some pattern, of algorithmic change, which is actually compatible with the survival of the person. But it's not at all clear what that pattern is. I mean, they haven't said anything. Maybe deleting a few bad chess playing habits is kosher. But what about more serious mind sculpting endeavors, like adding several brain chips that give you entirely new cognitive abilities? It's just not clear if you could merge, even according to the transhumanist favorite view. So these same tech gurus who are advocating merging with AI don't have a clear intellectual justification for that position, even if the science works. So given all this, here's my recommendation. I recommend a stance of metaphysical humility, if you will. First off, what I mean by that is claims about survival that involve a person transferring their mind to a new type of substrate or making drastic alterations to one's brain should be carefully scrutinized, okay? And that's because there's intense philosophical disagreement about all of these issues. And we really can't ignore this. In fact, as I like to tell my students, philosophy in this context is actually a matter of life and death. So they should stay awake in my class. Okay, so furthermore, even enhancements that merely involve gradually replacing parts of the brain without enhancing cognitive or perceptual skills, like just replacing, could be risky, especially if it's true that the brain is essential to who we are. Okay, so that's just something to consider. A safer approach, if you do want to enhance, is limited integration with AI through removable AI-based devices. Like maybe when you go to work, you have a sort of intellectual exoskeleton you put on, like a brain helmet, literally. Also, biological enhancements for longevity and intelligence augmentation, or implants that don't remove existing brain tissue. But remember, even radical biological enhancements, if you do them, in the same way that you would add a new perceptual or cognitive ability, run into the same self-sealing potentially, which is, when is a brain augmentation compatible with your survival? So my job then, as a philosopher, is actually to pursue some of the technical issues here involving the seat of consciousness. And in fact, we'll be pursuing that at my new center and with some wonderful new AI researchers at FAU that I've been working with. And I'm really excited to be working with them and learning so much about the brain and AI. But my other role here is to wear the hat of a public intellectual and inform the public of the risks. Okay, so all this being said, I want to conclude by just saying something very quickly about seeing all of these issues against the backdrop of a really big picture, the entire universe. And in fact, as I'm speaking, there's a rover landing on Mars right now that will be landing fully autonomously. And that's at 2 o'clock. That's at 2 o'clock. If you go to NASA's website, you'll see that. So things move pretty quick. And what I want to say is, in my time as NASA chair, I was very surprised that they sponsored my research and even made me a chair based on the ideas actually that I discussed briefly in this talk. And you might wonder, how does it connect up with the universe, issues involving the universe? Well, it has to do with the shape of intelligence and the future of intelligent systems, and whether there might be design ceilings on augmenting biological intelligences, and whether biological intelligences could keep up with artificial intelligence. In exoplanet research, there's talk of all of these Earth-like planets, all of these planets that seem to be in principle inhabitable because there's so much like us. And it seems like every week somebody discovers a new exoplanet, and it seems very exciting because it gives one this feeling that there's life out there. Well, the debate over the nature of life in astrobiology is very interesting and heated. But what I will say is this: if there is life out there, and if it does survive its technological maturity, like if it gets to the point that it's not just microbial life, and you start seeing sophisticated intelligences, and they start flipping on their own computers, and they start augmenting their own brains, we might find that the most intelligent beings out there are not biological. The most intelligent beings out there may be post-biological, to go back to that transhumanist idea, having augmented their intelligence to such a point where they're no longer technically the kind of biological being they were. And in fact, the most intelligent beings could be full-fledged AIs, and they may not even be conscious. So that's where we get back to the ceilings idea, okay? So this inspires humility. I mean, these issues in philosophy about the future of the mind, about whether machines could be conscious, don't just characterize issues that may be going on Earth within the next few decades. They characterize the shape of intelligence throughout the universe and whether the most intelligent systems out there are biological or synthetic or even fully artificially made beings. I mean, not just synthetic in the sense of a biological being with one brain chip, but full-fledged AIs. And remember, it's just textbook in the field of astrobiology that Earth is a relatively young planet. So these other civilizations, if they exist, would be at least 50,000 years older than us, according to many projections. So they really could be full-fledged AIs at this point. But the big question is, are they conscious? Okay, so yes, I do think this all inspires humility. And to quote Carl Sagan, it's a great place to end. He wrote in the film Contact, "You're an interesting species, an interesting mix. You're capable of such beautiful dreams and such horrible nightmares." So, remember, our technological prowess isn't enough. To flourish here, we need to get it right. We need to think deeply about foundational issues. So we need to appreciate the philosophical issues lying beneath the algorithms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's actually one of my favorite quotes from the movie Contact that you have there. So.
That's one of my favorite movies.
What's that?
That's one of my favorite films.
Yes, mine too. All right, we have a number of very interesting questions already. Just as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please open the Q&A pop-up. You can reach that by hovering your mouse on the bottom of your screen and just click on the Q&A button there and type your question. We will try and go through as many questions as we can in our time here. If we don't go through all of them, we're going to ask Susan to answer the remaining ones offline, and we'll post the answers on our website together with a recording of the presentation. All right, Susan. So how can you talked a lot about being conscious and consciousness. How can you know whether another being is conscious, be that another human, another species of life, or AI?
Good question. Okay, so, if it has a nervous system, I think there's good reason to think it's conscious at this point. Because, one way to quickly describe this is each of us can tell that we're conscious. And we can tell that it feels like something to be us. And we infer that the people around us, because they have similar nervous systems and they act similarly, that it feels like something to be them. And we also see this with non-human animals as well, right? And of course, there's a big question, like, where does consciousness begin? But I think we can be comfortable making intelligent judgments at this point in the biological realm. In the AI realm, it's tricky. For example, I was on Neil deGrasse Tyson's show with Sophia, the android. She's just a head. She's made to look like Katharine Hepburn. Okay. But anyway, there are people, she doesn't look like Katharine Hepburn, but there are people, it's like Wizard of Oz. There are people, every time you ask Sophia something, she either goes through a loop and completely to the audience looks like she's answering it herself, but it's a programmed loop. And then if the questions get too hard, there's someone back there typing, okay? Now, Sophia might act conscious. At least, some future version of her could convince us. You can already see very human-like androids in Japan, for example, that from a distance look human. So I always caution people against what I call the cute and fluffy fallacy. If it's cute and fluffy and it's an AI, don't fall for it. So how do we really know? I mean, clearly we have to look under the hood. So in my book, Artificial You, I propose different tests for machine consciousness. So, one is a test I worked out with Edwin Turner, an astrophysics professor at Princeton, and Princeton's patenting the test. I don't know any company that's going to buy it, though. But the idea is actually a Q&A test. You give the AI, and you actually prod it to see if it has that felt quality of inner experience, whether it feels like anything to be it. And I published the questions in my book and also in a blog with Ed. We wrote a piece for Scientific American. There are other tests as well, though. I mean, I think we're going to learn a lot when we begin to actually replace parts of the brain with microchips that underlie conscious experience. I think then if we have like crazy cases of deficits in consciousness, we're going to just have to keep rebuilding those chips. And if years of research failures are just like in front of us, at that point, we might just say, I don't think microchips are the right stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Following up on the definition of consciousness, one other question here is that your definition of consciousness seems to be very similar to what some call qualia. How do you relate the two terms?
Yeah. Okay. So philosophers call that felt quality of experience qualia. It's sort of a weird term. But I'll just say this. I don't mean all the things that philosophers mean when they talk about qualia. For instance, here, I'll give an example that's fun. Philosophers build in this idea of privacy to this notion of qualia. And consciousness does seem nowadays to be a very private thing, right? Like, it's not like, stuff going on in my head, thank God, is shared. But in contrast, though, I mean, obviously that could be changed if you got, a certain kind of chip, but there are real world cases of twins. There's a craniopagus twin case right now, two girls that actually are joined at the thalamus. And so they actually share conscious experience. They have a novel anatomical structure called a thalamic bridge. Mm. So that the philosopher's notion of qualia is a little too strong. I think consciousness isn't intrinsically or essentially private.
Thank you. Do you think so? We have already quite a few smart devices, technology all around us at this point in time. We're using it right now, right, to communicate with each other. Do you think that as modern humans, we have already somewhat merged with artificial intelligence through the use of, for example, personal computers? Even though this is not part of our brain, physical part of our brain, have we already lost the part of ourselves and our humanity through the use of all these technologies?
These are really good questions. And thank you to the audience. I mean, wow. Okay. So yeah, it's hard to even touch on all of that. I mean, you might ask, in the context of how our children are being raised, for example, with all this technology, are they learning the way we did? Notice that few people have time for books anymore and they're on blogs all the time. I mean, it's changing the way we learn. It may be too invasive. I mean, I have a lot of privacy worries. In fact, the new center at FAU that I've created has a lot of work going on right now already on topics involving drones and surveillance. We have a faculty member leading an initiative, Andre Miller. So I can't really touch on all that. But I think there's a sense in which we might take a defeatist attitude and say, well, what the heck? We're already so connected to our devices that we might as well just go with the brain chips. And I think there's an important difference here between what is not directly connected to the nervous system and what is, okay? Because we still have nervous systems that, we're picking things up, we're putting them down, they're not actively in the brain. It's a whole new ballgame from both the metaphysics of mind standpoint, about the nature of mind, but also the information privacy, data privacy standpoint, whether to have, chips in the head. I mean, I talk about, if you think data privacy is bad now, what about a thought data economy? Right? I mean, having read a lot of science fiction, what if the best example I like to give is, what if you get a brain chip to help your memory and it puts your memories on the cloud of your children and you have to pay some company for your cloud subscription, and then you're in an authoritarian dictatorship and you lose control of your own thoughts and you can no longer get those thoughts? Or what if somebody can tell you're a dissident? You think this is far away, but it's not. Over at Facebook, not my favorite company, they have something coming out in beta testing in only a month at this point. It's a wristband, and it detects motion initiation in the brain. So it's going to be rolled out in the context of Oculus. It was developed by the person who developed Internet Explorer, Thomas Reardon. We've talked several times. He's a brilliant, really smart person. But that technology in the hands of Facebook means that your motion initiation could be sold to the highest bidder, Cambridge Analytica, whatever. And that technology, if purchased by an authoritarian dictatorship, like China, for example, could become extremely frightening. Yeah. That was a long answer. Sorry.
That's perfectly fine. Okay, so going to the next question. Even without AI enhancement, our brain is changing its material substance every day by neuronal death and plasticity. Yet over most of our lives, we have a sense of self, of persistent self, right? Can you speculate as to what quantity or quality of change would destroy our sense of self?
Well, in the context of our everyday lives, reading some Oliver Sacks could help. To be honest, because it's best to bring up here and now cases in neuroscience, cases of individuals. Like there's this lovely TED Talk by Jill Bolt Taylor, who she had a stroke and she actually temporarily lost her sense of self. And she describes it in such detail. Her book is called My Stroke of Insight. So real world cases. But what about the permanent loss of self, like in this metaphysical sense? Because there's one thing, it's one thing to talk about the part of the brain that represents the self, that you may lose that temporarily, the way what happened to Jill Bolt Taylor, for example, but still be the same person from this deep metaphysical sense. Maybe you have the same soul, for example, to gesture at the soul theory. Now, I have a friend who they're doing an HBO special on, who lost all of the memories of her childhood. She fell down a ravine. It took her 6 months to recover. She's now an acquired savant. So she now is an expert on string theory, philosophy, all kinds of things. She did not pass first grade.
Wow.
Yeah, and she's entirely different. And she says to me, and she reads the philosophy, she thinks she died when she fell down the ravine. Her body's still there, right? So all we can do is look at these boundary cases, like the craniopagus twins. But I don't know if we'll ever have any certainty. That's why I advocate this position of metaphysical humility, because I think there are good reasons to respect the leading theories. I can't argue against, all the religious traditions that there's no such thing as a soul. And it would be a joke for me to try to tell people what to think. I just think we have to go to the public and explain these issues to them.
Very interesting, very difficult to answer, I'm sure. Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit here, and I know we're almost out of time. So one question here is, you have worked with amazing people. I second that one. So the our attendee here is curious, which scientist or philosopher has influenced you the most?
Oh boy. Oh gosh. I have to say Jerry Fodor because he was my dissertation supervisor. Um, so, and he was arguing the brain wasn't computational, but Jerry launched this whole modularity of mind perspective, as well as this language of thought perspective, you know, where he investigated the format of thought. And he was an amazing philosopher, brilliant, was generally regarded as the most important philosopher, living philosopher for many, many years, died recently. And he and I had such intense arguments. Oh my gosh, so bad that he actually stood up during my dissertation defense and screamed, F the brain. And he, the real world, he had a tantrum. But I now really read a lot of David Chalmers, you know, the author of The Hard Problem. He's great. And I envy, admire, you know, Martin Rees' work, you know, the royal astronomer who works on future of humanity and issues. I mean, there's so many people to admire out there, which is good. They paved the way, you know. And, you know, it's hard to, you can never do what they do, but you just move forward.
Well, in all these discussions that you have with these individuals, I'm sure that just gets everybody thinking, right? I mean, that's like the nature of it, right?
Yeah, and the pandemic's been really tough in that way because
Oh, yes.
that intellectual stimulation, being able to meet such incredible people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to close with one last question, which is also a very different question. So, if you have so we have an individual here also with a philosophy degree, undergraduate degree, and that individual has an interest in AI ethics. Do you have any suggestions on job opportunities or what to do with a philosophy undergrad if you have an interest in AI ethics?
Yeah, that's actually a hireable area. From a PhD standpoint, it's hard to find enough PhDs in that field right now, which is good. That's good for philosophers because, you know, we want the PhDs to get jobs. But you can also get a master's degree and do advising at think tanks. You know, even as someone with just a philosophy degree, you could go, you know, do research at a think tank, for example, and learn more. So I think there are all kinds of options there in the policy arena. And, you know, unfortunately, the ethics advisors at some of these companies get kicked around a lot, like Google. I mean, you hear that they resign and, you know, I think it's hard to be a whistleblower.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's really hard. But they do, these companies do want ethics advisors. They probably also want to push you around a bit.
Right. Well, you're working sort of against them, right? Or from their standpoint, you're working against them.
Yeah. I think it's got to be a hard job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We're about out of time. I know we have a number of more questions. Susan, we will ask you to answer some of them offline, and then we'll post your answers online on our website together with a recording of your presentation just to make sure everybody has their questions answered. Thank you so much, Susan. Before we close, I wanted to mention that the Center for the Future of the Mind that Susan is overseeing has a speaker series. And within that speaker series, the next presentation is on February 25th at 2 p.m. By Bernard Bars on consciousness, understanding the science of subjective experience. So if you have an interest in this topic, please, call in. It's virtual again. Contact us if you can find the information, and we'll get the information to you. With that, thank you very much, Susan. I look forward to hearing more about your research in the near future.
Thanks, everybody, for the great questions. And Karen, thank you for hosting me. It's nice to see you.
Good seeing you.
I look forward to reading everybody's questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Susan. Bye-bye.